Mustafa Barzani was born in 1903 in the village of Barzan in modern-day northern Iraq, but at this time the Ottoman Empire. When he was just a few months old, his home village was attacked by the Ottoman Hamidiyye horsemen, and he and his family were deported, where he spent a long time in prison as an infant. Following an insurrection launched by his tribe, he and his family were imprisoned when Barzani was only 3 years old. His father, grandfather, and a brother were later executed by Ottoman authorities for other insurrections. In 1919, the 16-year-old Mustafa participated in the Mahabad Barzani revolts, where a series of armed Kurdish uprisings occurred under Sheikh Mahabad Barzani against the Iraqi authority in the newly conquered British Mesopotamia and later British Mandate in Iraq. Mustafa and his men were following orders of the Barzani tribal sheikh and Mustafa's brother Ahmed Barzani, and they crossed into the Piwa Valley and joined Sheikh Mahmud Barzani. Even though they were ambushed several times on the way, Barzani and his men managed to reach the sheikh's location. However, they were too late to aid in the revolt, as it had already been suppressed. Mustafa would then participate in the Ahmed Barzani revolt from 1931 to 32. He became one of the most notorious commanders there during the revolt. However, British-era bombardments led to widespread damages and setbacks, leading Sheikh Ahmed to surrender to Turkish forces and the then contested border with Turkey in June of 1932. Meanwhile, Mustafa Barzani continued fighting for another year, and on the advice of Sheikh Ahmed, Mustafa Barzani surrendered to Iraq instead of Turkey. Mustafa was kept under surveillance until 1943, where he again broke free from his exile during World War II. In 1943, Mustafa and Ahmed Barzani would lead yet another Kurdish revolt against the British in Iraq, this time 2 years after the British had retaken Iraq from the pro-Axis Rashid Ali government. Just like before, however, this revolt was eventually put down by Iraqi assault troops in October of 1945, combined with the fact that many Kurdish tribes defected to the British. As a result, the Barzanis retreated with much of their forces into Iranian Kurdistan. After World War II, in December of 1945, the Kurdish Republic of Mahabad was declared by Qasim Muhammad, the leader of the Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran, in Mahabad, which was under Soviet military control and was meant to become a Soviet puppet. Mustafa was appointed as the Minister of Defense and commander of the Kurdish armies in the Republic of Kurdistan. As Iranian forces began to engage the forces of the Republic of Mahabad, Barzani quickly proved his reputation as a capable commander, with his forces inflicting defeat after defeat onto the Iranian divisions, and he was one of the few who did not surrender or defect to the advancing Iranians. However, Mahabad would fall to Iran as the Soviets abandoned their puppet state. On December 15, 1946, Iranian forces entered and secured Mahabad. Once there, they closed down the Kurdish printing presses, banned the teaching of the Kurdish language, and burned all Kurdish books that they could find. However, Barzani's forces still put up stiff resistance as they escaped to Iraq and Azerbaijan within the Soviet Union in the following months. In Azerbaijan, Barzani feared the psychopathic Lavrenti Beria and went to the Uzbek SSR. He would later meet with Soviet figures like Georgy Malenkov and Nikita Khrushchev in May 1953, after the death of Stalin, to ensure that the Soviets would continue helping him and his followers. Shortly afterwards, Soviet officials moved Barzani to Moscow and enrolled him in the Party Higher School, where he would leave the USSR following the 14th of July Revolution of 1958 in Iraq, where the monarchy was overthrown. In October, Barzani and his followers returned from the Soviet Union, and he quickly established warm ties with the new president Abd al-Karim Qasim, and Qasim hoped to use Barzani as a potential ally in the power struggles within Iraq after the revolution, as Qasim faced considerable resistance from more nationalist-minded Arab officers and intellectuals in the country. Mustafa Barzani faced similar challenges within the Kurdish Democratic Party, with divisions over land reforms, political positions, and alliances with other parties in Iraq. The Iraqi communists, Barzani, and KDP sided with Qasim during an uprising of Baathists and other pan-Arab nationalists in Mosul in March of 1959, entering the city to fight off the insurrection. And following a deadly riot instigated by Iraqi leftists in Kirkuk in July of 1959, Qasim would denounce the Iraqi Communist Party, and Barzani would also do the same. However, Qasim became suspicious of Barzani, worried that his increasing power in Iraqi Kurdistan would allow him to become a potential source of opposition to his power in Iraq, and possibly where foreign intelligence could instigate instability within Iraq. Qasim also began to capitalize on tribal divisions in the Kurdish region, creating and instigating disputes between tribes. Qasim had been eyeing Kuwait and suspected that the British would support Barzani militarily if he did an invasion. Therefore, Qasim decided to provide armed support to pro-government tribes to keep Barzani from becoming any stronger. And by early of 1960, it became apparent that Qasim would not follow through with his previous promises to give the Kurds regional autonomy. Therefore, the KDP began to agitate for more autonomy, and in the face of growing Kurdish dissent as well as Barzani's power, Qasim continued to incite intertribal warfare throughout 1960 and early 1961. By February 1961, Barzani had mostly defeated the pro-government forces, and the Jash tribes slowly began submitting to him. Barzani's forces began advancing through northern Iraq and were bombed, which halted their movements. In June of 1961, the KDP issued a detailed ultimatum to Qasim outlining Kurdish grievances and demands for autonomy. Qasim ignored the Kurdish demands and continued planning for war. It was not until September 10th, when an Iraqi army column was ambushed by a group of Kurds, that the Kurdish revolt truly began. In response to these attacks, Qasim lashed out and ordered the Iraqi Air Force to indiscriminately bomb Kurdish villages, which ultimately served to rally the entire Kurdish population to Barzani. The First Iraqi Kurdish War officially began on September 11th, when Iraqi planes began bombing Kurdish regions, following an ambush on another military convoy. With the official start of the First Iraqi Kurdish War, Barzani would often seek and gain support from the KGB, CIA, Mossad, MI6, and Savak, as well as support from Syria and Jordan, depending on which country was opposed to the Baghdad government at the time. He took advantage of the complexities of the Cold War and Middle East. This is something that you'll definitely see with all the internal stability within the Iraqi government. Anyway, on September 24th, 1961, Qasim ordered the closure of the KDP, and the following December, Barzani and the KDP severed its agreements with Baghdad and entered into hostilities with the government. It was around this time that Barzani attempted to gain support from the United States, which was the first of his ventures for foreign support during the First Iraqi Kurdish War, and since Qasim was anti-US at this time, America kind of agreed. Barzani would lead the Peshmerga so effectively during the war and inflicted mass casualties on the Iraqi military, to the point that Qasim offered peace twice, in November of 1961 and in March 1962, which were both rejected by Barzani, who requested Kurdish autonomy. These demands were unthinkable for Qasim, who knew that such concessions would damage his image too much in Baghdad, and the military campaign would wage on against Barzani. On August 23rd, Qasim's government would conduct a special population census only for the province of Jazira, which was predominantly Kurdish, and around 120,000 Kurds in the province would be arbitrarily categorized as aliens. Through the rest of 1962, Barzani's campaign proved to cause Qasim's position in Baghdad to become increasingly unstable, and he directed the KDP into talks with the Baathists and Nasserists, the two factions that most despised Qasim. Additionally, Qasim's anti-Kurdish policies coincided with the discovery of oil fields in the Kurdish-inhabited areas of Syria, which led Ba'athist Syria to join the war in 1963 in support of Iraq. Syrian troops crossed the Iraqi border and moved into the Kurdish town of Zakho in pursuit of Barzani's fighters. However, things within the Iraqi government were complete chaos. On February 8, 1963, a military coup took place which overthrew and executed Qasim, and this was the Ramadan Revolution. The Nasserist Colonel Abdul Salam Arif became president of Iraq, and the Ba'athist General Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr became prime minister. The latter resulted in a Ba'athist domination of the government, forming the National Council of the Revolutionary Command. However, Arif would overthrow al-Bakr and oust all the Ba'athists in November of 1963, so the Nasserists now controlled Iraq. After yet another failed offensive on the Kurds, Arif declared a ceasefire in February of 1964, which provoked a split among Kurdish urban radicals on the one hand and Peshmerga forces led by Barzani on the other. Barzani had agreed to the ceasefire, and the radicals were fired from the party. A subsequent agreement between Barzani and Arif would end hostilities between the government and the Kurds, although autonomy was not included. By this point, Barzani turned his attention towards asserting his leadership over the KDP due to the opposition from various factions, namely what would become the PUK led by Talabani and Ahmed. Soon the political divisions evolved into one that saw Barzani leading tribal and conservative elements of Kurdish society on the one end, with Talabani and Ahmed leading progressive-minded leftist intellectual Kurds on the other. Barzani, however, benefited from his agreement with Arif, which secured him funds and arms from Baghdad to assert his position. Additionally, the Kurds were supported now by Iran and Israel, but no longer by the United States, which ended support for the Kurds following the 1963 coup. With his power secure, the KDP, Barzani raised the demand for autonomy to President Arif again, which quickly soured relations between the two. In March of 1965, hostilities began between Barzani and Baghdad once again, leading to a massive military operation in northern Iraq, which saw nearly 100,000 troops deployed by Iraq to fight Barzani and the Peshmerga, as well as other Kurdish factions such as Talabani and Ahmed, which had returned to Iraq to fight. The operation was inconclusive, with the government unable to make any significant gains. By this time, Barzani and his forces were receiving even more supplies through the Iranian border, and the war was further complicated by the winter, which played into the Peshmerga's advantage. The government again utilized divisions among the Kurds within the region, and had begun supporting Talabani and Ahmed's factions of the KDP, who entered into hostilities with Barzani and his supporters. Before a major operation was to take place again in March, against Barzani's headquarters near the border of Iran, President Arif suddenly died in a helicopter crash on April 13, 1966. Arif was succeeded by his brother Abdul Rahman Arif, who recognized the troubles the war was bringing and sought to cement his own position in Iraq, and he decided to visit Barzani that fall. Barzani accepted Arif's offer of a truce, recognizing the toll the war had taken on the Kurdish populations at that point. However, the July 17, 1968 coup would occur while Arif was asleep, and his own assistants, along with members of the Ba'ath Party and Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, overthrew him in a bloodless coup, and the war would continue with Barzani leading the Kurds. And that is the end of Part 1 on Mustafa Barzani. Part 2 will see the end of the First Iraqi Kurdish War, the Uneasy Peace, the Second Iraqi Kurdish War, and the aftermath, as well as how Mustafa Barzani fits into all of it. So keep an eye out for that, and thank you for watching.